Well, hello everyone. Welcome to A Second Look, and welcome to yet another excursion into the ancient Near East. You've heard the Indiana Jones theme, which is a direct giveaway that our subject's going to be archaeology tonight. Maybe from a little bit of a different perspective, we're going to be having a book report on this great little book I picked up at the Dollar Tree called Thieves of Bagdad. And here to help explain what this book is about and to take us along this next 28 minutes is my good friend, Mr. Alan Doshna. It's the kind of a book that easily could be made into a movie, right?
Right, yeah, it's a very exciting, well, it's very interesting. First off, for the character, the main character author, Matthew Bogdanos, who comes from a very diverse background. So from a character point of view, it's very interesting in how the later events came together.
It's almost like character-driven, as they say. Well, you've written for and about Hollywood with this magazine, Film Facts, which is why I thought you'd be intrigued by this book as well. But so tell us in a minute or two what you've been doing along the lines of Hollywood.
Well, I've been involved with a number of projects in various stages of development, and most recently, the one most important to me at this time was kind of an offshoot of Film Facts article, which became a book. I'm assisting actor Richard Anderson with his memoirs, and who's had a higher profile recently with the release of the $6 Million Man DVD set, which is Lee Majors.
Yeah.
The very famous opening lines, if you can hear it there. But,
I think there's a whole,
Bionic Woman.
and the Bionic Woman as well. So you're doing his biography.
Right.
And Richard Anderson is another multifaceted guy, right?
Right, producer. And so
we'd all recognize him in his wire glasses if we saw him. Does he still wear his wire glasses?
No, it's a very interesting story as to how he wore the dark glasses in that segment. It was just something, his eyes were red, and when people saw it later, it just connected. There was no real, it was just to camouflage the redness.
Well, there's the movies as they were and the TV as they were. And tonight, like I said, talking about Thieves of Bagdad, what's this all about? What's happening? What's going on?
Well,
why this book?
Right. Matthew Bogdanos is a very colorful character, assistant district attorney, spit and shine Marine, a competitive boxer, and he was called into service after 9/11 to investigate terrorist networks and financing, and one thing led to the other, and he ended up ultimately, the subject of the book was his working with the Iraq National Museum and recovering the treasures that had been looted.
Yes, apparently he ends up in Kuwait after being in Afghanistan. Apparently at one time the Iraq National Museum had 500,000 artifacts, which is incredible. But it's not so surprising, because I've been saying for years on A Second Look that archaeology almost began there.
Right.
He calls it the cradle of civilization.
Right.
This is something you've been delving into yourself here.
Right, yes, and he mentions at one point, the items go back to Ur of the Chaldees, and where Abraham, the patriarch of all the three major religions, was called to go to on down through Persians, Greeks to present day, and it's like an unbroken line of culture to our present day.
I guess you could say Bagdanas, with his Greek background, he's Greek American. You said that his family ran a Greek restaurant in New York.
Right.
Which it doesn't get
actually
much more Greek.
Yeah, in fact, his father owned three. His mother was French, but his father owned the three restaurants, and he and his brothers worked at them. And it was there that he learned that duty comes first. And he has a very interesting kind of a intense anecdote where one time he was he put an order on the spike, which for the cooks to see, and his hand came down too hard, and the spike actually went through his hand. He pulled it off, and his father kissed his hand and then poured Clorox on the hole, and he said, "Table 13." Is waiting for their food, and he turns to his mother for sympathy, and then she kisses it and says, "Table 13 also needs water."
Right, So there's no escape. This is the making of a Marine. He ends up in Kuwait after getting a medal in Afghanistan for some of his counterterrorism, and then of course there's the U.S. invasion in April 2003, and Bagdanas is there. And what is it that sets it up? Does he hear all these media reports?
Right, actually, he gets a frantic phone call one night from someone who was quoting some of the newspapers and media reports of this large-scale looting of the Iraq Museum. And so he begins to look into it, and he sees the necessity of someone going there to just secure the museum, and obviously it's a public relations nightmare, and it kind of was, but there was nothing set up, so he kind of made it up Indiana Jones style
This
as he
is
went
it.
along.
Yeah, right.
And drove in a convoy.
Yeah, we've got pictures of Bagdanas and his men that I guess he sort of drafted into this. You almost get the feeling when you read the book that he doesn't have much authority to do this, but yet.
Right. Well, it's interesting because he worked within the system. There's like there is kind of a gray area that people knew and trusted him and trusted his judgment, and it hadn't been done before, and there wasn't the time to just detail it. So they gave him as much leeway as they could, and he was able to bring it together.
This was his mission after graduating from Columbia. A man who knew Greek and the classics. There's a picture of his small staff that he takes a couple of jeeps and half tracks, I guess, and barrels down the road to Baghdad not long after the American forces. And we forgot to mention that the first media reports were that there were 170,000 pieces that were,
Yeah,
and I guess he found out it wasn't that much, but it was pretty bad.
Right, it was like factor of 10.
What was the motive for the looting?
That was, actually it was, he talks about the nature of truth, and that the various elements of, there was the hostility towards Saddam, and there was just the natural greed, and so this is what he deals with throughout his account, that trying to bring out the best in people to get them to return the items.
To return it, which becomes very interesting.
And so by that trust that he builds with them, he begins to find a lot of success, and people just start bringing things back that they took for safekeeping. Right.
That's going to be, we're going to get into that a little bit in a few minutes. I know that one thing he was worried about too was some of the money for this black market was going to fund Al-Qaeda. I think maybe that's how he got permission to even have some kind of a, he's just like, it's almost like he takes off to Baghdad with us. You mentioned stopping in Babylon was important for...
He called it a eureka moment because he had to do this kind of a Henry V, a pep talk with the people he was dealing with to try to initiate.
His buddies or his squad, they thought he was a little bit phased going off after
Right, and going through the desert unprotected, and
right.
and so he was able to get them to agree to come with him. Certain, select ones, but they passed through Babylon. They made a point to go to
Right.
Babylon, and he spends a chapter talking about that experience and just being there and what. The cradle of civilization,
Right.
and the hanging gardens, and the former glory of Babylon, which of course no longer exists, but just knowing that this is where history
It seems
was.
like that was the moment his squad realized, well, there's something to.
Right, that it just kind of gave a boost to morale and
was
a
their-
new incentive to the whole mission.
And we'll have a look at, that was their aha moment. This might be a good time now. We've got a 5-minute clip showing some of the artifacts in Iraq. Like you mentioned, this is the cradle of civilization. Archaeology almost began there in the 1920s. The British under Leonard Woolley were digging in Iraq. Artifacts I've shown, some of them in picture form, many times on this show.
We've got a
And
slide
5 years ago, we did a show
of
on
some of the
famous
treasure.
artifacts of Iraq, and I think we're just about ready to play that 5-minute clip of the artifacts that were brought into the Iraq National Museum in Baghdad, and some of them were beginning to be quite a few, right? He didn't say what was his final total. They lost not 170,000,
Right.
but something like 30,000
Right.
were looted for sure, yeah. So here's that section here of a show we did 5 years ago, which will show people, our audience, some of the valued treasures of the Iraq Museum. So this picture will show some of the artifacts, what they call the treasures of Nimrud. And there's another picture just before this, which I think we'll have a look at as well, which will show us some of the greatness of the treasures of ancient Iraq. And that really depicts some. Now, I've shown you the Ishtar Gate that the German Koldewey had transported back to Berlin around 1900. Well, these remains, most of them are from the Leonard Woolley expedition in Iraq in the 1920s. This was a British expedition that uncovered the ancient city of Ur, and probably one of the most famous relics from that particular expedition was the helmet you see on the left. It is the very hard to pronounce helmet of Meskelamdug. The helmet of Meskelamdug, going all the way back to 2,400 years BC. This was lost during the Iraq War in 2003. Thieves, looters, or just people who were trying to, stash some stuff away, made off with the famous helmet, and in a grave, as it says, it was buried, found in a grave, and it was buried in a farmer's backyard. And when Bogdanos and his team got wind of this great discovery, of course, they were overjoyed. So the next picture will show you the helmet as it has been recovered by the American forces there in Iraq. You see the helmet now, and then you see it again. And it was buried in about a foot and a half of dirt in a farmer's backyard. So you can imagine how excited they were to uncover that particular find. The other photos on the top left and the top right, I'll explain a bit about this. This represents the treasure of Nimrud. Now, in the video clip, we talked about Nimrod, the man Nimrod, mentioned in Genesis chapter 10. And it's amazing how archaeology sometimes is very good at verifying ancient history and even biblical history. Because these famous treasures of Nimrod, I do believe, dug up again by the Woolley expedition in the 1920s, contain more than 1,000 pieces of jewelry, precious stones, and ornamentation weighing more than 100 pounds and dating to the height of the Assyrian Empire in about 800 BC. Now, this was recovered from the vault of the Iraq Central Bank in one waterlogged metal box. This is Bogdanos, Colonel Bogdanos of the U.S. Marines in charge of recovering the looted antiquities of Iraq, reporting here. Recovered from the vault of Iraq's Central Bank in one waterlogged metal box, but was originally discovered in 1988 by Iraqi archaeologists in 4 graves in, oh, I correct myself. So then those artifacts, the treasures of Nimrud, were not found until 1988, and they were actually found by Iraqi archaeologists in 4 graves in the town of Nimrud, and had been in the basement of the central bank for 13 years. And on the left, you can see here the Queen's Crown, which is a beautiful, beautiful find. I mean, if you're on an archaeological dig, and as I keep saying, meeting my wife on an archaeological dig in Jerusalem in 1970, you're lucky to find a nail or even a piece of stone. If you find a piece of stone with an inscription, you are absolutely delighted. It's almost the highlight of your whole summer. But here you find this beautiful Queen's Crown inlaid with gold leaf and decorated with 8 winged figures. So these were recovered from the vault of the Iraq Central Bank in a metal box that had sort of gotten waterlogged. But that was the story, and that's the story that Colonel Bagdanas passes on to us here in this very good article in a very interesting issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, which is one of the popular magazines you can get on some of these things. And so where does it stand today, and what's the story? Well, we're back on camera. We're covering this book, Thieves of Bagdad, about the exploits of Colonel Matthew Bagdanas back in April 2003, trying to recover many of the looted artifacts from the Baghdad or the Iraqi National Museum. They feared at one time, they heard the reports that there might have been 170,000 artifacts lost, and actually he found, and it's less than what I thought earlier, 13,000 were lost, and Bagdanas is able to retrieve about 5,000 of them. Now that'll be our talk here a little bit in the second half. We've just played a clip of some of the great treasures that were found there. And truly in this book, my good friend Al Doshna has been reading this, bringing us up to speed on it, that Colonel Bagdanas's resume would put Indiana Jones to shame. As a New Yorker, you'd have to agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you know.
That's the theme music.
he's really got a way about him. Like I said, he's in a hurry. So
Right.
as we mentioned, even in that earlier clip, some of the artifacts were actually for safekeeping stored in the bank, right? Is that what the Iraqis call the secret place they kept talking about?
Right, right. And in fact, one of the would-be looters that they found. What's interesting about the book, too, as far as making it into a movie, there's actually very little in the way of direct violence. It's all mostly interrelationships between people. And then there are things that happen on the side, but it's actually not, you know, an action picture as such. But there was one account of a looter who tried to open one of the vaults with a grenade rifle at close range, and they later found him, what was left of him, after they drained the basement.
Yeah. You know, that's a brilliant point. This is almost a redemptive story in some ways. In the middle of all this war swirling, and he's only there a few weeks or a couple of weeks after the U.S. troops take Baghdad. So, and he works, you mentioned it's a human relationship story. It might be time to talk about Nawala.
Right. Yes, she was the director of the Iraqi Museum and National Museum, and she was looked upon as being kind of a taciturn woman. Her nickname was Dr. No, but she was an expert in cuneiform, but had recently been promoted to a director of the museum, and she didn't rub everyone the right way, but somehow with Colonel Bagdanas, they kind of hit it off, became warm friends, and became, you know, his friends would kind of rib him about, you know, this affair going on with this you know, somewhat older woman, and but it was also interesting as far as, see, all the people at the museum were subject to the Saddam's regime, so he didn't actually know who actually was a dyed-in-the-wool supporter of
Right,
Saddam,
right.
or who was doing it because they were between a rock and a hard place. And so this is what he had to sift through.
Yes.
And that he was able to develop that relationship,
Right.
particularly with her, but as well as the other people.
He's a project man, and his project is to try to retrieve and preserve as many antiquities, because he's in love with this as a graduate of Columbia University and a Greek speaker and everything else. We had a nice picture up of Nawala, and she's actually, I think the next picture will show that, she's actually looking at something that belongs in the museum. I don't know if it was lost, but at least they're moving it, I think, at least from the bank to the museum. And the next picture shows this beautiful golden helmet. It goes back to 2,500 years before Christ. This is an incredible find. It's 1 kilo in weight, and it shows you the kind of things that are, you might say, floating around in Iraq, which is almost like an archaeologist's playground in a sense. So she's got that, and she has her hand firmly on it and making sure nothing is, and it's really interesting that Colonel Bagdanas, as active and aggressive as he is, while you were talking, I thought of the phrase "stoops to conquer." That he's someone who knows how, if you want to get something done, you've got to get along with people, right?
Right, exactly. And that's the striking thing about him too, is that he's a colorful personality, but he's not your typical kind of go in and blow everything up, Rambo type character.
Right.
He's no question, he's a dyed-in-the-wool American Marine to the core. But at the same time, he, as the book progresses, and actually even throughout the book, he has a lot of respect and compassion and love for these people.
That's what happens, and it's, you mentioned earlier, that Tom Cruise would probably, because he's diminutive. Bagdanas is the shortest of, we had a list of him with his squad, he's the short guy, almost in the middle.
Yeah, and this energy and enthusiasm and ability to, carry off the mission, I think that would be
Man with a mission, a man with a purpose. Look out, I'm going to do it, but I got to work through people. So now I found fascinating in this book, and talked about it even 5 years ago, some of the tactics the Marines use to round up antiquities. And talk about that a little bit. What were some of the tactics that he used? Because he realized this loot is all over Baghdad. So.
Right. Well, the main thing was the amnesty, the general amnesty that, no questions asked. Just other than, would you like a cup of tea, which is a big thing, the friendship, and which also we're talking a little earlier about. This is sort of a companion book to the Greg Mortensen book.
Right.
3 books, 3 cups of tea. That about education, and so this is a little different approach.
Yeah,
but
Mortensen is the American mountain climber who was rescued by the people in northern Pakistan and becomes their lifelong, goes back and builds schools.
Right, but the tea factor,
is really important.
Is the relationship.
Yeah, he has a line about I've drunk more tea than I thought it was possible for enough to float a battleship or something. So he has amnesty, and then he advertises in the papers.
The newspapers, he gets with the imams and the other religious authorities to pass it on to the public, and just a public relations approach. And over time, it brings people in, like, for instance, the young pianist who brings in the bull's head, I think it was, and the statue of Shalmaneser.
Yeah, and is that the first day? Was that the first day return?
I think that was the first.
Because that was pretty big.
Right.
Shalmaneser is mentioned in the Bible, Shalmaneser III, and there's a famous obelisk of him in the British Museum, which we've shown before. But I was intrigued that when he talked about getting all of these things back and meeting people on the street, there was this story about one guy he could tell was sitting on some, and he said, well, I like to box. And Bagdanas, I used to be a boxer. He had to end up boxing, just to get to know the guy.
Well, and actually, that was he talked with him about boxing, established a contact, but then later, one of his associates had to get information from someone there, and so he staged in order to distract attention from his a friend, they set up a boxing match, and he said if this guy let loose, he would go head over heels like in a comic strip.
And all the
But,
while, his wife's
right.
back in New York, and she's having another child. And
Right. Right.
Yes, I was intrigued, I think, by page 152, where it says, right off the street, someone brings in a 7,000-year-old clay pot,
Right.
which Bagdanas says predates the wheel by 2,000 years. So this is what we're talking about. Apparently there's 4,000 archaeological sites scattered across Iraq, and God grant that peace will come so we can
Right.
start digging around in these areas again.
Right.
It's quite a...
Right. In fact, he towards the end of the book, he devotes at least one chapter talking about the black market of antiquity and cultural items and that how understaffed and underfinanced
Exactly, yes.
agencies are in following up and the type of people, the different stratas of society that are working together, and they're so outmanned that
I think this is pretty well what he's doing now too in his present life. He was like I said, an assistant DA in New York.
Right.
And but he talks about the need for an international consortium to get a hold of this, because some of it is going into the funding of the war on terror. So you were intrigued, as I was, with how he respects the people of Iraq. And what did you learn about people in Iraq from this?
Well, it's with this as well as other sources. They seem to be very lovable people that you wouldn't, if you knew them, if you you wouldn't want to see any harm come to them. But then there's this terrible situation, and how can it all? But yes, he's very committed in his very last lines of the book that I know you can't help but be drawn into them.
They've been around a long time. A lot of they were doing brain surgery in Baghdad in the 800s. So there you go. Right. And this is maybe a good time to just hold up the book, Thieves of Baghdad, one more time. And truly, Bagdanas operates at twice the speed of the world around him, they say. And like I said, a pretty good deal for 99 cents at the Dollar Tree. Al, thank you for coming along, for reading the book. Sharing your insights. We'll have a lot more to say, I'm sure, about the country of Iraq. And for those of you who joined us, thank you for the students at Duarte High School who worked here with us on the ROP program. We'll see you next time on A Second Look.